Welcome. It's pretty humbling to be a second time here today. Thank you for joining us and our panel for a session today where we'll cover component-based media. So just a quick show of hands, who has not heard of component-based media? All right, okay. So we'll start by talking about a little bit of why component-based media, why are we doing this, why are we being driven there? And then our panel will be able to, I think we're setting aside a good 30 minutes Q&A where we'll be able to have interaction with our panel and understand their own personal experiences, success, and challenges they've met into implementing component-based workflows. I'm Pierre-Anthony Lemieux, and you might remember me from this morning, although here I'm wearing my IMF User Group chairman hat. Something we're going to try today, and this is in the spirit of the HPA retreat and innovation, is we're going to do an online Q&A. So slido.com here, I really encourage all of you to go there on your mobile or on your PC, and you can ask questions. And not only you can ask questions, you can see what other questions have been asked, and you can, thumbs up. I'm not sure there's a thumbs down, but, you can thumbs up. And so when we get to the Q&A, we'll use that list. I'll use that list to actually pose questions to the panel. And one advantage of this is you can ask questions whenever you want. You can also see what other people have asked, what kind of questions others have asked. And so it's worked very well in the past, and so we'll try it here, see what happens. I might get disinvited from the HPA Tech Retreat forever. We'll see. Anyway, so without ado, let's get started. So why component-based media? I think this is more out of necessity than just pleasure, and it's really driven by some really basic shift in the entertainment ecosystem. And one of those shifts is gone are the days of a single deliverable with HD material and 5:1 channels, right? Now we have UHD, we have HDR, wide color gamut. New things get added every day. We have immersive sound in addition to multi-channel sound. Access services are a big driver also. It's now possible to include really great access services. We're talking about subtitles and captions, but also sign language. And so there's a ever-expanding SS repertoire, right? So masters that used to be simple now are much more complicated because they have more types of essence, but it can also grow with time. There's also gone are the days of people just watching content on their TV. People watch content on many different platforms, many different environments, going from mobile phones, very different experience, both in terms of ambient noise, but also aspect ratio, to TVs in their living room, to laptops, to small screens on buses or in mass transit. So each of those viewing experiences generates new version of the content, or certainly content that can be adapted to those different viewing experiences. So again, gone are the days of a single 16:9 or 4:3, or 16:9 with 4:3 center cut version. Also, a really significant shift is the emergence of global content platforms. Whereas content used to be very local, much content was produced locally and consumed locally. Now we have major platforms, Netflix, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, that have a global reach, and now content can be distributed internationally. And that means multiple languages. It means multiple edits for censorship or simply for translation, and also various different metadata requirements. Different territories have different, typically sometimes have different metadata requirements. And again, what that means is we have a whereas masters used to be simple, it used to be one tape on a shelf, we have now very complex masters that have very different technical versions that evolve over time. And component-based workflows were really come about to address this challenge of the growth in content versions. What is component-based content? At its simplest, it's just instead of having a single a single interleave, multiplex interleave of audio and video content. Now you have components, so individual audio, video, subtitle, caption, sign language, video tracks that are brought together into a playlist. And the idea, of course, is that components can be reused across different playlists. So if the difference between a French version and an English version or US domestic version is only subtitles and audio, there's no point in recreating a brand new multiplex, just a new playlist that references the same video, but different audio and subtitles can be created. And that has really few really important qualities or advantages. One is it's really easy to add components as you go along, right? On day one, you might have only US domestic video, audio subs. A week later, you might get German, Spanish, French, Italian dubs and subs, and now your master has now grown. You can add those components without impacting the existing components. And for instance, that means less QC. You don't need to re-QC things that have been QC'd before. Increased automation. Hopefully this all happens automatically. And now you have a evergreen master from which you can create deliverables as needed. And really the goal at the end of the day here is to really lower barriers to both worldwide distribution, make it less expensive and less complicated to distribute versions to smaller territories that in the past might have been out of reach simply because their costs were too high, but also lower the cost to acquisition. So IMF, I'm sure you've heard about it, and it's hard for me not to talk about it. It's one piece of the puzzle. It's component-based master format, specifically targeted at high-quality masters. It's a worldwide standard developed by SMPTE. It was initially published in 2014. It's as much as possible uses existing established technologies, XML, MXF. It uses some of the structure, some of the concepts that were introduced with digital cinema, which was one of the first really worldwide component-based workflows. So the way IMF works is there's a core that's common. Let's say maybe it's common to 90% of all applications, and applications are a specialization of IMF to different specific domains. Here are two examples of application. One is based on JPEG 2000, the other one is based on ProRes, but otherwise everything else is the same. And again, the idea behind this architecture is that from an implementation standpoint, there's a 90% commonality across all applications, especially a same timing model. So component-based media is new to a lot of folks, I think, and it's not really, I think, been introduced at the same rate everywhere, right? Not everybody has had this international distribution or acquisition problem at the same time. And it's sometimes pretty, it's difficult, right? You go from a single version to now having to handle those multiple versions over time. I think, you know, it's, what's been happening is many organizations around the world have been tackling this and have created forums where users and implementers can get together and overcome those challenges of really adopting those different workflows. And so some of them include SMPTE. The EBU has had a pretty significant effort on component-based media and IMF for a number of years. The Digital Production Partnership has also been working hard on this. NEBA is also working hard. And so really, maybe this is a time to mention, right, as opposed to existing, to past experiences where maybe there had been a single vendor proposing a single solution. In the case of IMF and component-based media, it's largely driven by multiple users and multiple vendors together as a community. And so really the way for anybody to really get involved with component-based media is to get involved, right? To become part of these communities and provide feedback and provide resources. One such community is the IMF User Group, dedicated to IMF. It's 90+ members, large and small, multi-billion-dollar companies to single individual, meets quarterly in person, with remote participation. The next meeting is an NAB. And again, if you're new to component-based media, or if you're interested in component-based media, I really encourage you to join one of those organizations, including the IMF User Group. So I think I've said enough, and I'd like to turn it over to the panel. And so I think what we'll do is everybody has prepared 2 slides. We'll go over that, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So let's take it away. I think the first one is Chris.
All right.
You can, yeah.
First of all, is Annie Chang in the room? Just out of curiosity, is she still here? I can't see her. All right, great. So I just want to say, first of all, Annie, when we started working on this 5 years ago, I never would have thought that I'd be spending Valentine's whispering sweet nothings about IMF to the whole room. So thank you for that. But it's actually great work. We all in this industry owe Annie a round of applause or a thank you, because it's really great work. We wouldn't be talking about it without her. So why did Netflix embrace this? Obviously, we were facing down. Our first IMF was actually House of Cards Season 2. That was the first show that we ever did in IMF. And we were facing just a huge global expansion, and we knew that we were going to have masters. We knew that we had seen the practices of the studios as they gave us versions for different regions, and we just knew that we didn't want to hold a bunch of different masters for all the territories we operated in a format where 90% of them, 95% of them were exactly the same, and it was just some small differences that made those masters different. And we also wanted something that was open and that was going to be a standard and that relied on open formats for us to then build our supply chain on. And it also allowed us a lot of efficiency around storage and delivery. So we knew that if we could just take delivery of sort of a few heavy lift assets and then just, again, the differences all in one package, that was something that was appealing to us. And then the last one was that it was extensible, right? So that later we could add new experiences for our viewers. We've done that with, for instance, immersive audio. We didn't have to send a whole new package when we decided to start doing masters with immersive audio. We could just send those tracks, update the CPLs, and then we had basically new masters as we rolled out new experiences for our membership. So that was really why we did it. I'll tell you a little bit if you go to the next slide, Pierre. So where we are today is that most of our original content, not all of it, there's a few genres that just don't really benefit from that particular format, but it's very small. Most do take application 2E. And then we are today using supplemental packages to do fixes. So for instance, this is showing, if you really squint, there's a dead pixel in there. That's something that our QC department would reject. Under our old supply chain, we would have had to take an entire new delivery just to fix that one frame. Today, we can do that with supplemental packages and only paint out that one defected area, and then we don't have to take an entire new delivery. And we've also seen the industry really embrace this, particularly on the manufacturing side. So pretty much every time I come to one of these events, there's more support, more products that support IMF. So it's really becoming a pretty mature option for component-based delivery. So that's kind of where Netflix sits today. And I guess we'll hand it off to you, Lucas.
Greg, I think.
Yeah. I jumped the order here.
It's component-based panels.
And interchangeable. Well, and that's the thing that's kind of interesting is that when I think you'll probably hear the stories are very similar. It's like you build a lot of. By the way, my name is Greg Geier, Sony Picture Studios, and I think like when we look at kind of the reasons why we jumped in is probably a little bit different. But then eventually, as you kind of go through it, we start seeing the exact same benefits. And I think as we've talked just throughout this week, it's very similar, starting points, and you just start reaping the benefits immediately when you start talking about the amount of versions that you're QCing and the amount of man hours and time and automation that you can kind of instill into the process. So for us at Sony, we were lucky enough to where we were actually solving a 4K issue. Now, IMF isn't bound to 4K only, but that was what we were solving up front because we had, at the time, Sony, Papa Sony, wanted to launch a 4K streaming service. And, at the very beginning stages, it's like, well, what do we do? Are we, we're obviously not going to HD CAMSR with that. We're not going to send DPX files, uncompressed DPX files all around. That would just take days. And we had a timeline that was pretty crunched. I think it was like 100 titles or so in a handful of months that we had to really get completed. So as we kind of went into this, it was kind of learn on the fly as we were going through this, and we knew that any time we burned in the R&D phases, we actually gained, efficiencies in the background, because our very early stages of deliveries, there's mistakes, a lot of mistakes, and as Chris had just touched on with the supplemental packages, that issue didn't become a complete new delivery. It became a supplemental, CPL with just the new frames, and that sped up production time tremendously. And so as we kind of go through that, we started to, adopt a standard, which is the other thing that we really, really like about this, is that, when we looked at, media asset management tools or applications to wrap around this product, we knew that we could, it was very clear, and I'm sure that everybody's struggled with having conversations around the specifics of your delivery, whether it's ProRes, whether it's some MXF-based format, and you have to kind of integrate and develop with, all the different, products that are out there. And then for the product creators, right, they're trying to keep up pace with all of the different asks from all the different companies. And it was really nice to be able to point to a standard and say, hey, we just want to hit this, right? And we know it's similar to what maybe, Fox is doing, or what Netflix is doing, or some of the other people in the community. But it allowed for you to really anchor in your ask, and it not being something super specific. You're just maybe turning some knobs, but you have this general bucket that you're trying to hit. And as we operationalize this process, we've brought features in this process, we've got television, and we've got trailers. So we've got all of our content going through this. And what's really neat is more recently we're kind of helping some of the, looking at some, processes that are around immersive audio, and that's a whole nother discussion. But as we've gone through and remastered stuff that was 4K in that initial delivery, and now we went through an HDR process, we didn't have to reconform everything, right? So the audio and the subtitles, that process, that if anybody's been part of a catalog remastering process, and when we went from NTSC to HD, and then everybody felt like, okay, now we're going to IMF, great, it's another thing we're doing. But when we just replaced the track file, right, and everything lined up, it's that aha moment that all of a sudden your costs for remastering go way down, and then hopefully you can do more of that to help monetize the overall catalog. And so, for us, and these are just kind of some high-level stats for things that we're doing, and it's real. It's something that we're really kind of pushing through, and the next iterations that we're going through is, as we continue to develop this process, the important part is that localization aspect, because that kind of, it blew up in a great way in the last 2 years, but we were able to, because we already had this baseline process that was built out for efficiency, we're just adding, little pieces and little components instead of making brand new masters. And, tying, so for us, tying the CPL, or the composition playlist, to like an IDER, right? Now you've got this whole supply chain that you can kind of push out there, and it's kind of industry recognized.
Thank you. So Jack?
So I'm Jack Wenzinger. I'm a solutions architect for Amazon Web Services. I have a great job where I get to work with the media entertainment vertical technology partners as they're leveraging AWS to support the media entertainment environment. To be honest, I have a confession to make that only a few people of you know, like Joachim Zell. I actually started in corporate IT, which, as you all know, has a charter of global standardization of technology for cost savings, which is wildly different from the charter that media entertainment has traditionally had from a, leveraging technology for revenue generation. So if you think about that, though, with the cloud and all of the changes that we're seeing now and the ability for standards like IMF to be run, We're seeing now that we're coming back to global standardization of technology for cost savings, which is something that's needed for the media entertainment environment to keep up with the, the high demand of the high quality content that these gentlemen, shepherd every single day. So, some considerations of this are the ability to be able to create a target service architecture where you can leverage some of these great technologies over and over again to support multiple workloads. A place for my stuff, we talk a lot about content lake architectures where essentially you can create an environment to ring fence your content, which, adds augmented security because you can implement, encryption at rest and in transit and do that by default without really thinking about it. And then there's multiple technologies out there like own zones and gray meta, and other AI services that will help you establish a baseline of metadata against all your assets, so you can finally find your assets and delete the ones that you don't want to keep. And then just the sheer scaling capability and taking advantage of opportunistic compute like spot instances in the cloud. And then honestly, it's being able to work and integrate with the M&E vertical technology partners that are all supporting this space and component-based delivery. It's really cool to be up here. Thank you.
All right, Luke.
And I'm Lucas Carboni from Fox Global Media Services for the next few days anyways. So we're the, I might as well mention it, right? Just to kind of put some context around where we fit in the Fox universe, we're the main media manufacturer on the studio side. So we make a couple 100,000 deliverables a year for distribution to thousands of entities. We handle about 45 TV series and 20 feature films on an average year. And we're managing about 50,000 titles worth of metadata that goes back, nearly 100 years into the archive, plus a lot of track titles across the industry. And we master and make mezzanines for service and archive content that ends up at about 2,300 platforms globally in 194 countries. And like the other gentleman said, 63 languages, lots of localization, lots of things to swap out. And I mentioned our Fox Fast and Fox Media Cloud platforms that are really the back end and front end complementary to this effort and tie into some of the things that I could talk about on the component side of this adventure. And along the bottom, just a quick hit list of the brands that we cover. So I see my animations in the slide were a little out of order here. You can just, yeah, it's perfect. In the last couple of years, we've had a couple of big successful component projects that are worth calling out here. One is just our transition to IMF mastering and servicing generally, something we've been involved with for a very long time, as many of you have. We really made the flip in the last few years to making this the de facto way that we master all of our UHD content and HDR content. So now we're scaling up an inventory of about 6,000 compositions, about 1.5 petabytes of data, and that's a mixture of lossless masters and lossy servicing IMFs. And then the Movies Anywhere project, if some of you are familiar with that, was the first time that we were taking really a full component distribution approach for a launch cycle. A lot of platforms had started with that muxed media for their initial launches, and over time had evolved into being component-based, so would take additional audio and subtitle assets to go along with the content already there. This was a big platform push, so we moved about 1,300 feature titles onto this platform, again, leveraging standards. So this was all Movie Labs-based componentization in HD, and then, again, the first Movie Labs IMF partnership for delivery, pairing, I guess you could say, wrapping, for all of our UHD titles that landed on that platform. So that was a big feat. And then there's a couple things on the horizon related to just component distribution and IMF specifically that we're excited about. One of them is the IMSC 1.1 text support. So as the evolution of these components and the standards underneath them continue to improve, we can change out or enhance some of these tracks that make up a composition or an experience or a presentation or however you want to communicate it. So in this particular case, we have enhanced support for Japanese text-based subtitling and HDR signaling in the subtitles. We're also excited about immersive audio bitstream, the IAB initiative, so 2067-201 as a plugin to IMF. We've got some document improvements on the horizon. Believe it or not, these documents have now been around for long enough that we're improving and enhancing them, and that in and of itself, because the documents are components, they can be improved individually, and some of these exercises really make things a lot clearer for implementers and integrators to roll out and develop against. And then just a specific project that I've been involved with for a while now and is really getting underway is an automated forensic watermarking application leveraging IMF for all our global distribution. So it's hands-off forensic watermarking on the fly during the actual distribution process, which in the context of IMF provides a number of wrinkles about how packages are compiled and verified and checksummed and so on. So these exercises have been fascinating, but they weren't just to be clever. We've actually had a lot of success in cutting down our storage footprint, enhancing the turnaround times in mastering and remastering, and really just having a rock-solid foundation in a standards-based universe, which we're really excited about. That's it.
Thank you. All right, so we'll move into Q&A now. So again, we're going to do a mixture of live in-room Q&A, but also online Q&A. So please point your various devices to slido.com, #IMF. And it's actually working. We have a lot of questions. So I think...
Heckle away.
Well, exactly. So I think we're going to get rid of the first questions really quickly, the one that has the most thumbs up. And the question is, why did Jack not wear a jacket?
So as I said, I've been trying to pretend I'm an M&E guy for about 15 years. And have you seen an IT guy, right? They sit in the desk. I have said, have you tried turning it off and on again? But no, I didn't get the memo on the jacket.
All right. So I expected nothing less from this crowd anyway. First, next top question before we go to a question in the room. So what about external metadata tracks like HDR10 and DTX Profile 2? How does this mastering information pass through to the viewer at home? So does anybody want to take this?
Anybody? So those specific examples like HDR10 Plus, I would say, that's something we've been involved with at Fox. So I guess I should preface this by saying this panel is really focused around components broadly, but IMF specifically is the way that I think a lot of us have integrated that into our supply chains. So in IMF, there's controls now with the sidecar asset map for carrying along external, sort of loosely defined or undefined materials that you want to travel along with a package that you're supplying. But I think there's a lot of investigation and a lot of exploration that has to happen about ways that we can enhance synchronized metadata along with these track-based files. There's already a lot of controls for time text carriage. There's ancillary data tracks. But the more bespoke types of synchronized content that needs to be developed, I think it's a good opportunity to develop some generalized, robust frameworks that can be used inside an IMF package. Some of the things we can predict and see today in the work being done on the dynamic metadata color volume transform. But I'm sure there's going to be exciting things that get developed. Just this morning, Bruce, we were at the breakfast roundtables talking about, synchronizing character information, on-screen character information during playback and those types of things, and having good, clear ways to signal that if a producer chooses to include that in their content for distribution. So there are some means. They're relatively young, meaning that they're not well implemented in a lot of the manufacturing tools today, which means there's room for opportunity for refinement and experimentation.
Anybody else to want to share their thoughts on, experimental or extension metadata tracks in IMF and component-based on how you've been dealing with it? Any surprises? Any things that, is the answer to standardize it and then deploy it, or?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases it's what's useful, right? And I think we can come up, because the ability to enter anything into this ecosystem is so flexible, I think sometimes you almost have to limit yourself at the buffet as to like what you actually want to put into the application, right? Into the IMF itself, because I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's like the answer is yes. You know, and I think in a lot of cases, what you have to do is really identify, with a particular partnership that you're looking to build, and say, well, what am I actually looking at trying to achieve with this, right? What are they using it for? How are they using it? And I think that's kind of the interesting thing with all of the questions around IMF is in a lot of cases you can really get to an end game solution a lot quicker because it does have so much. I think we've all been struggling historically with sidecar metadata, right? That's always been something that just kind of doesn't feel quite right. It's a little bit separated. It always comes a little bit later. Maybe it doesn't have everything that you need. And so when you can really build that out and use standards that are out there and kind of bake it into that one delivery package, then you can really start talking about the world of automation.
Okay, any questions in the room? All right, so next question online is, what type of MAM do you need to integrate IMF at the studio level? Yeah, any off-the-shelf solution?
I mean, one that looks at the standard of IMF. And I think that's actually, we were just outside talking about, and there's a ton of solutions that are starting to look that direction. But that's kind of the neat thing about this is that, I think historically we've all been, someone in this room's been burnt by some solution that, you went with, and it was a big monolithic application that made a lot of sense, and it took a lot of time to develop. And what's really nice about any decisions you make with that is, at the core it's an IMF, right? It's not some proprietary ingested file that only can be read by that one media asset management system, DAM, whatever you want to call it. And so there's less, and also the component-based nature of it is that a lot of the applications that are out there today are component-based as well. So whatever the best available transcoder is, you can plug that in. Whatever the best asset management system in the background around your archive solution is something you can plug in. And you have this really nice, agile application that you can now leverage any way possible. I mean, there's a lot of people that are building their own because it's something that's more tangible, and you're not going to see it, change, all that much as long as you stay within those confines.
Yeah, I was just going to add, we chose to build our own, but it had more to do with, it was not because there was a lack of solutions that we could have used. We felt that we could optimize for our business best if we had our own tool and could look at that across our entire ecosystem. So it was a business decision, not a lack of off-the-shelf possibilities.
In our case, we decided to buy one and build one, just to cover our bases. So on the build side, again, both projects were approached with the concept of, like Greg was saying, like it was to the standard. When the question was, what's the solution here, and what parts of it do you want to implement? It was an easy answer to say to the standard. It's the resolutions and the bit depths and everything that the standard supports. It's the behaviors and the composition structures that the standard supports. And that might be a broad canvas to paint on, but it ensured that we were able to make business adaptations along the way without disrupting our MAM or having to reprogram or re-engineer things. So in the case of choosing a commercial tool, again, it's looking for their IMF literacy, but also their component-based storage and repackaging literacy. It's because here, I mean, we're talking so specifically about IMF, but it's really about taking these atomic particles and rejoining them into molecules on demand when necessary for the destination it's being delivered to. And so on the commercial side, purchasing seemed like a quick win. And on the building side, it's where things need to be highly integrated with very sensitive systems, authorization systems, contract systems, and the like, where it was going to be too impractical to try to look at that through a commercial vendor. But still, to the standard, componentization, we're storing those atomic particles and then manufacturing the glue, essentially, that binds them into those molecules on the way out the door.
And from a cloud perspective, what we're seeing is that the fact that we're taking and providing a commodity infrastructure that people really love, the server storage and bandwidth capabilities. MAM providers are now focused more on the user experience and the media tooling that power these types of solutions.
Okay, next question online, I think is a recurring question. What about security in this brave new world of component-based media? And specifically, are these components encrypted? Where are they encrypted? How are they encrypted? What are the challenges of working in a cloud? Jack, you want to?
So from my perspective, I mean, that's one of the beauties of AWS. We have the shared responsibility model where we take on, a component of the security from the physical data centers up to a point, and we also provide tools, and a lot of the different technology partners provide the up-top security components. But from encryption at rest and in transit, and of course the AI ML tools that can use machine learning to identify areas where you may be vulnerable to a breach.
Yeah, I'll say on our end, IMF allows for the future capability of an encrypted DCI behavior, DCI, digital cinema package-like behavior, KDMs. It would be an interesting scenario to get towards. There's some challenges to it in a business-to-business type deliverable scenario where we're not necessarily delivering to just a playback endpoint, but to a processing endpoint. So that hasn't been fully developed as both, the characteristics of how it would behave, but also just sort of taken through the supply chain logistics of where could it go wrong kind of a thing. But it's definitely something we're interested in. Yeah, like Jack was saying, securing the perimeter has become sort of a basis of a working model, and having better tools to make sure that things aren't sitting on live and accessible storage, but are encrypted at rest, in fact. But within the standards that they're produced, at the moment, we don't have an equivalent to the KDM for DCPs.
So they're encrypted during transit, during exchanges, right?
Yep.
By the transport layer.
That's right.
All right. Has cloud made content protection better, worse? I mean, any thoughts on that?
I was going to say, for us, it just makes it different, because I think that, as Lucas just touched on, it's like, you're kind of securing the perimeter. But in a lot of cases, that security kind of almost, outsource that security, if you will, right, with partners like AWS. And I think what's really, interesting in this whole dynamic is that in a lot of cases, I think there's room for almost less mistakes because of the component-based nature of things, right? I think historically, somebody could hit a button and, a ton of files can fly out. But, if you can lock it down to where at a certain level in the contract, it has this metadata that ties to this exact instance that they're selling, all of a sudden, you're lessening the handoffs, the human nature handoffs, and really driving a different type of, delivery. And I think in a lot of cases, what we're trying to do is really, partnering with people that can, right? In some cases, it's just not that easy because you're delivering to folks that, maybe don't have all the capabilities, right? Because, for us and less for some folks, you kind of have to also work with all these different companies to onboard and have that partnership, have that conversation. And that's really, I think, some of the harder parts. So when you talk about security, whether, however you're transporting it, what it really is having a core understanding of the concept and then driving that throughout the overall workflow.
Well, actually, it's a paradigm shift in the cloud, right? Because if you build this content lake, you can actually have your suppliers come to where the content is and provide access and work in a secured environment. Whereas, with the on-prem facilities in the old model, you have a lot of these walking around with guys with sneakers.
Man, you were carrying that this whole time?
I was. The only problem is it doesn't weigh anything because what happens?
Somebody already took it.
It would have been easier to hide it in a jacket.
Hey, I'm with Amazon. I'm supposed to be wearing a hoodie.
So what about, what would you say your best advice would be to someone who just gets into component-based workflows and is about to deploy one? Any thoughts, Chris, on this?
I would say read the spec carefully. The standard, I should say. Read the standard very carefully. No, I mean, I think it's a little easier now. The barrier is a little easier because, again, a lot of the tools are mature. The understanding around it is a little bit more mature. But it is different. And so people have to make the case internally as to why it's beneficial to do it. Because, again, in some instances, you still see even cost deltas, where so if somebody asks for an IMF deliverable as opposed to, say, a ProRes deliverable, a lot of facilities will charge a lot more for that because it's still new enough that there's some novelty to it. We're seeing that mostly adjust down and normalize, but so I think there's the business case that you have to understand and be able to make internally, and then also, again, understand the standard and what you're dealing with.
And so do you think these challenges are the ones that have been preventing folks from adopting it, or is it simply that not everybody has run into the same issues or at the same time? Or?
I don't know, and maybe Lucas and Greg have a different opinion because they also deliver IMS, for customers. But I mean, I would say that a lot of times it's because there's multiple delivery points they have to go to, and maybe their anchor customer can't take IMF today, and so they still have to kind of serve lots of different masters, and that's sort of the tricky part because it's not a silver bullet. There's still a ton of use cases for flattened files.
Yeah, I think with the rollout to component methodologies for anybody as a content recipient, it's don't try to transition the entire supply chain overnight. Don't try to just glom onto it and radically reorganize your infrastructure because that's where we see the projects fail. They fall short. They just become too big and cumbersome. But start small by adhering to a standard, picking something standardized. So IMF is a great basis on the media side. Movie Labs is a wonderful basis on the metadata and packaging side for communicating synopsis and artwork and other information. In putting those things together, spend the time to study the underlying links and the way that can become a seamless edge. So that can be a business-to-business exchange that's relatively frictionless, but there still might be an internal process that has to go on where that componentized media is at some point flattened in its life, and a standards and practice edit happens, or interstitials get cut into the broadcast, or there's some other activity that goes on. It's not defeat to say it didn't make it in a componentized way all the way to the consumer cell phone. Sometimes these are just really efficient means for me to supply 25 languages to one recipient. And that's okay, even if at the other end it gets picked up and turned into 25 ProRes files. Because that's the basis for the building blocks to be built out a little bit further and a little bit further into the supply chain. So it doesn't have to be everything all at once.
Well, I'd add to that is that additionally, I think it's education, and it's also the craft of the message to the person that you're trying to get the message through to, right? And I know that's really simple. It's a basic kind of scenario, but it's like if I'm talking to finance, I'm going to tell them about how I'm not going to buy as much storage in the future, right? And if I'm
telling stories, are you?
No, I'm not telling stories. It's true though, and I think that and then so when I'm talking to the to the sales team, it's like, hey, like if you use this IMF, it's a lot less than if I have to manufacture something. And then when I'm talking to the teams that are like the buyers, if you will, or the ones that are coordinating the efforts, it's feeling comfortable that that I know it's not a tape anymore, but this thing serves the same, endpoint, right? So you can make whatever you need off of this thing that you could have made off of this tape or off that flattened ProRes. And I think it's having confidence with that. And I feel like, where some of the barriers will have kind of opened up is that, transcoding in general has become, less of a challenge within the industry. I think when we started, there's, if you look back in 2014, there wasn't many tool sets that could handle what it is we're asking for it to do. And then now that barrier, I feel like it's kind of starting to break through a little bit.
So I think so thanks. I'm going to try to kill a couple of birds with one stone here. So first, guess I feel sorry for Jerry and Leon that don't have a job anymore. And, but also, I think maybe a question to the audience directly, if somebody can share with us what's been their obstacle to adopting component-based media or workflows and IMF, and how can the community help better? So anybody wants to share that with us? Because evidently our panel is already wedded and they drank the Kool-Aid. So the question of why have others not adopted it, I think, and how can we help folks better, I think would be good. Go ahead.
So, as a post-production house and service provider, I can tell the IMF creation is not really a one-button solution at the moment. And I wonder if the studio responsible people meet often enough, because we have a drop-down menu for Netflix, for Warner Brothers, for Fox, for Disney. Every studio has their own format. And will there be in the future a one-button solution, like creating a DCP, that we just create one thing with perhaps 2 options instead of 100?
Well, I would argue in creating a DCP, there were still some choices to be made. It's still a choice. But yeah, so there's obviously a disparity, and this was a hot topic in many conversations today, on the final delivery specifications, the constraints that each content producer or content recipient will put on the market to make that content for them. That's something that I think we can endeavor to become narrower on. There can be less distinction between these choices. But I think one of the things that we've shown great success with is that there's still a high degree of interoperability despite those distinctions. Meaning, if one producer decides to choose one particular bit rate or bit depth over another, the recipient that receives those 2 variations with the majority of tools on the market can easily decode both of them. There's not a disparity in decoding behaviors. Now, that doesn't always solve every problem, because you, as a vendor, you have those technical challenges of trying to serve many clients, and so you're constantly producing different variations depending on who it is that you're serving at that moment. But I think a real focus on interoperability has driven out a lot of the roadblocks when something would go sideways, which says, oh, this isn't my audio configuration, or this isn't the bit depth or bit rate that I'm accustomed to. But yeah, there's improvement to be had there.
Yeah. And I would add, we should endeavor to have the differences be smaller amongst us. We do have different use cases, and so there's just different needs that need to be met with those masters. But I would say that if you looked under the hood, they're mostly more similar than they are different. And it makes for great marketing to have a drop-down menu with names on it. And so they are pretty close most of the time, with just some very subtle nuances.
And I think there's an effort to try to capture electronically the delivery specs, right? Those differences. I think there's I don't know if Dan Tattoo is in the room, maybe? So within the IMF User Group, there's a specific effort to try to capture those differences electronically, actually as an XML document, so that the process becomes more transparent than simply a drop-down, that you can see the exact differences between different delivery specs. So what about so here's a technical question. So you receive a composition, an IMF composition. How do you tell which title that composition is related to? So how do you retrieve the title that's associated with a localized version?
I mean, I can tell you, for us, it really has to, because we deal with a closed ecosystem, we have the luxury of not having to worry about things like ITER and things like that. So all of our versions are set up by a team that knows what we're expecting, and we have unique identifiers for that, and we basically put requests out against those assets.
And when the composition is
Right.
uploaded,
Right.
the
When
same
they're
ID.
uploaded, they're then bound, and and then we sort of have ways of checking that and making sure that that's the right thing. But again, that's because we work in our own ecosystem, and we have the luxury of kind of working in that way. But I know there's other ways to do it, so I don't know.
Well, I mean, for us, very similar approach, probably not as elegant, but I mean, there's a project management aspect to this at any point in time through the creation of whatever aspect is needed. So I mean, and for us, in a lot of cases, we're just gathering in, you know, stuff that's either already been created or we're supplementing that and creating the additional localization pieces. You know, and for us, in a lot of cases, it's the registration of and naming convention of said asset or composition, and then just normalizing that on the way in. We're working towards, you know, something very similar to what, you know, Chris is describing, you know, to where, you know, you're like actually putting an order out, and that order also is a fulfillment location for something to be pulled back into the system. But I think that this is something that we couldn't have even gotten to, you know, 5-6 years ago, and because of this, it actually invokes these types of efforts and allows for us to even achieve or even get close to achieving this.
So yeah, similar to these two experiences, we kind of believe if it's worth doing twice. So we have our own internal numbering scheme for titles and versions, and obviously that's, you know, based on a historical structure and is used to communicate to financials and when we can spend against a title and things like that. But we've also been proponents of IDER, so we leverage level 1 and level 2 IDER registrations against these assets. And to date, we've not made it a common practice to put those registrations into the composition playlists. There were some efforts that we did to come up with a best practice about how those would be communicated inside a composition playlist. And now that that's in place, we have a development effort to actually just integrate that into our supply chain. So those numbers will automatically be injected into the sequences upon ingestion into the system. So at least from a normalization and external delivery perspective, anytime we're delivering to any client, they will receive in the future, not as of this very moment, in the future they'll receive those IDER registrations communicated in the composition. And anybody that's not familiar with that, that's an external database, that's the Entertainment Identifier Registry, and they can look that number up to identify exactly what title and what version of that title it is. So that's helpful for anybody trying to organize these assets that might be receiving them from us.
So Lucas, I'm curious, have you guys looked at SMPTE 2112, the IDER Ad ID watermarking technology? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
No, not yet, but I love the number 2112.
You knew I'd get a Rush reference.
Yeah. Any Rush fans? No, we have not. No, there's a lot of activities about material identification, whether it be through forensic means or just numbering schemes within the assets themselves. But again, trying not to please everybody at the same time instantaneously, knowing that it would sort of be a little tenuous and potentially fall apart. We're trying to get traction in just sort of these small winnable areas and then start to build it outwards, because we'd love to support any numbering scheme that is meaningful to others to receive it. And also, admittedly, on the component side, we're not doing any ad-based materials yet at the moment. So we go as far as trailers, but it's not promo spots and things like that yet.
Yeah, I think from my view, I mean, it's obviously the numbering scheme's important, but you know, I'm very optimistic with when you see things like what Video Gorillas is doing and Zora and OwnZones with perceptual hashing and those types of visual machine learning tools, that they'll be able to marry that to some identification scheme and make that, you know, a simple process soon.
Yeah, and we're excited about some of that stuff just for being able to identify similarity, structural similarity between compositions. So there's also been some work done about how to express that two compositions are actually made up of identical cuts. There's a paper underway and about how to perform a best practice to fingerprint, so to speak, through a composition playlist, the edits that are made, so separate deliveries could be made over time and a recipient would already know and be able to acknowledge that they don't need to reprocess video because the video is identical underlying. So these are the kind of cool evolutions that I think at the outset of this weren't totally envisioned, you know, and as the building blocks start to go in place, we have these technologies at our fingertips now to start to be able to do some proofs of concept with and see if there's, you know, either some money to be saved with it or a real, you know, timing advantage to be earned out of it.
What about implementing IMF in the cloud? Any lessons? How is this happening? How is this happening, Jack? Maybe?
So, yeah, I mean, we know that Own Zones has already developed a service that is doing IMF delivery at scale with a multi-tenanted model. And that one's quite significant and has a lot of traction. We know that media asset management partners of ours like Delet and Vitaspine are also working towards they support IMF today and have those types of capabilities. But the cloud is well suited to support those kinds of things. From a elemental services capability, that the elemental platform can accept IMF source, and they'll continue to work down that roadmap of supporting more IMF capabilities.
One thing that gets interesting just in the cloud-based universe is, these assets, will put them into different stages of life. They might go off to a very cold storage location for an original version, let's say, and some months later, a supplemental, which is just maybe a language track and a subtitle, will come in. And if we wanted to leverage, let's say, a cloud-based QC tool, we would have to restore from that deeper archive back up into something like S3, that original picture track. And so thinking in that context and making our MAMs aware of those types of behaviors and being able to signal efficiently so that we can predict when things are coming in or upon arrival to trigger another action to happen, to restore something so that another activity can take place, all just sort of speaks to the sequencing of events that has to happen in a component-based universe.
I was going to say that I think that's kind of like where that question's really like, it's a really interesting time, because I think what we're starting to look at is, some applications like HSMs that can create common namespace. And so like, I think in a lot of cases, it's almost like we want to make it to where we don't know per se if we're working in the cloud or on-prem. Like, so the asset is just in the most most optimal place for whatever activity you're trying to do with it. And so, I think that it's actually very, it's something that you can really take advantage of, and we played a lot with it. I mean, on the delivery side, as you pointed out earlier, is that a lot of times we're not delivering, we're presenting, right? So it's like, hey guys, come get it, right? And which works out for everybody, because sometimes you'll deliver to broadcasters that, they can't take 100 files at the same time. They need they need to go off their own burn rate. And so, yeah, I mean, the cloud, I think, is something that's there. It's very tangible. It's being used today.
Okay, so any questions in the room, or anybody who wants to share their own experience, challenges, anything that the community can do better to support them? While we're passing the mic around, question came up, how do I join the IMF User Group? How do I get involved? Very simple, imfug.com. There's all the details there, including a little join button. So, and please come see me if you have any questions. Anybody in the room has any questions before we go back to online? Anybody has feedback on component-based? All right, this is your opportunity. All right. So next up on the list of questions, which I think is one that's been raised a number of times recently. How can IMF and the component-based media approach be used for archiving of a production's raw material in addition to the final output? So how archiving in IMF?
I mean, I think it's based off how you define archive. So I think, there's some efforts to have a quote-unquote archival IMF. There's also things, like AXF that's out there as well. But I think that, if you look at a traditional production, right, it starts fragmented, meaning that, there's the sound department, there's the picture department. I mean, localization is something that
Componentized.
It's componentized from the beginning, right? But I think that historically we've kind of kept those swim lanes, if you will, kind of all the way down. Like the archive was also the audio archive and the picture archive, and you had all these different locations. And I think the biggest thing for that particular question is that, in some instances, the video track file is the thing that changes, right? So as long as I got everything, conformed and built, and all the subs and the dubs all available, then I can, switch out, and I know I'm making it easier than it is, and some people probably shoot me for that, but, essentially you're changing out track files, right? And so I think it's something that, what we found already is, as we look at the amount of dollars we spend on downstream conforms and QCs, that we're always ingrained into all of these processes, because every time you deliver to a vendor or you rehash that material, you never knew it was conformed against. You didn't know what the quality was. We didn't know what the QC report was, and so I think that what you end up doing is you end up just procuring your assets in a much stronger set at the very beginning state, and linking all of that together, and then providing it to somebody who's a distribution partner of yours to then just replicate and churn and burn on that material.
I think Greg said a good point, which is like, what do you consider an archive, right? Because you could, depending on how deeply you want to go, I think that certainly there's a place for IMF at a certain level. I wonder if there's utility as you go really deeply into an archive, but I think it's something that, the thing that's interesting about it is that it's open, and it could continue to be evolved in a way that does support a very deep archive for assets. So I think the answer to the question is tough, because it's a little bit of a crystal ball question, but I definitely think that in the next few years you'll start to see maybe IMFs that are ungraded masters and things like that at an IMF level, but it's hard to know what exactly that'll look like.
Yeah, it's a convenient form of containerization. Definitely approaching that for solving the issue of how to deal with image sequence files, but not quite yet at the raw theatrical assets level. The App4 Cinema Mezzanine work that's underway endeavors to solve some of those riddles, or at least propose a solution for it. But even just in the App2E landscape for the IMF speakers, yeah, 16-bit BT 2020 is really good for us, and doing it mathematically lossless feels like an archivable asset. So we choose to store that long term, very high quality, mathematically lossless. It's the equivalent of those original downstream masters. So, but yeah, it all depends on your definition of archive.
So about to run out of time. So quick question, which is the top rated question right now. Will Slido.com replace Leon and Jerry? So just quick show of hands. Who likes this online Q&A?
We didn't get that many questions, though. Come on.
Yeah, we got tons of questions. All right, who didn't like it at all? All right, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much to our panel, and thank you so much. And
thanks, everybody.
Have a great evening. Thank you.